we'll have a panel discussion now amongst some of the authors of the text. On the panel are Wayne Cruz from CI. Wayne is a leading expert in regulatory burden, the burden of regulation, as well as homemade beer. My colleague Patrick McLaughlin, my former student, Liya Palagashvili, who starts this coming fall her career as an assistant professor at State University of New York at Purchase. So I'm going to sit down here and cleverly lead this discussion. The book, again, was inspired by the quest to better understand and document the relationship between economic freedom and entrepreneurship and economic growth. Now, all but the most misanthropic of people like economic growth. And if you like economic growth and you want to understand what causes it, you want to understand what promotes it so that we can have more of it, so that we can have more prosperity that keeps us healthier and happier and leading richer lives. And the way the book was assembled, it looks at these various connections, again, between entrepreneurship and economic freedom, between economic freedom and economic growth. And so I want to ask some of my colleagues here up the table with me some probing questions about the book. And I'll start with Liya, because I believe in ladies first. Liya wrote the introductory chapter, which was meant to sort of set up the whole book. So in a way, it's sort of the most wide-ranging of the chapters. I'll say it's very good. It's excellent. She's my former student. And
so you have to be nice.
I have to be, well, yeah, I guess so. In your research, when you did that chapter, what surprised you most? Did you encounter any surprises?
Is this on?
I think it's on.
Yeah, we're on.
Okay. So I'll start off with just what I found in general and then what I found the most surprising. So I found two strong correlations. The first one being that there was a strong correlation between the institutions of a country and then entrepreneurship. So looking across different countries around the world, what we find is that countries that have the best or most well-protected property rights and the least regulatory environment are the ones that have the greatest thriving entrepreneurial environment. And then the second strong correlation was that there was a strong correlation between entrepreneurship and economic growth. And this is a no-brainer. So countries that reward entrepreneurs and innovation will see more economic growth. So there's two strong correlations. One between institutions and entrepreneurship, and institutions are things like property rights and your regulatory environment. And then between institutions and entrepreneurship. And the second important one is between entrepreneurship and economic growth. And there are no studies that find otherwise, that don't find economic growth, that don't find a correlation between economic growth and entrepreneurship. It's so strong. It's the most important in economics. A thriving entrepreneurial environment, more business, more innovation, more business and more innovation leads to greater economies growing. So if we care about economic growth, we have to care about entrepreneurship. And if we care about entrepreneurship, we have to care about the regulatory environment. So that is the overall finding of the chapter. What was most surprising to me, though, was finding just how poorly the U.S. has gotten over the last decade or so. So there's a significant drop of the property rights element in the Economic Freedom of the World Index, where the U.S. has completely fallen on the property rights element, and they've also fallen in the index, in the Economic Freedom of the World Index, on business bureaucracy costs, which means that to start a business And to operate in the U.S. it has gotten extremely expensive in terms of business bureaucracy costs. And one of the other, I guess, surprising things that I found was just how much of your business profits in the U.S. go to taxes. So about 44% of business profits go to file, prepare, and pay taxes. And that doesn't even include compliance costs for all the different laws. So that is what I found to be one of the most surprising things when I was doing this research.
Wayne, how about you? You've studied regulation for a long time. Did anything surprise you still?
Yeah, my chapter, well, there's always room for surprise. My chapter in the book is called One Nation Ungovernable, Confronting the Regulatory State. And the thing that jumps out at me is just how much of the regulatory state we don't measure. I'm guilty of one of these $2 trillion estimates. I put together a study that I call Tip of the Costberg. It's a working paper on the cost of regulation. I use largely government's own numbers. You can actually go back and get GAO's figures on regulations from the 90s, OMB's from the late 90s and early 2000s. At that time, they were already pegging regulations at hundreds of billions of dollars. What's changed is that the federal government doesn't do an aggregate estimate anymore. So using even those old studies, you're still in the same ballpark of $2 trillion, but now we have all the new things. We've got Homeland Security regulations, Dodd-Frank, the Obamacare, all of these that have been heaped on in the last 20 years. But what really jumped out at me, and in terms of, we know about the cost of regulation of hundreds of billions of dollars, and we even know the numbers. Every year there are at least 3,500 regulations that come out of 50-plus major departments, agencies, and commissions. At the same time, Congress passes anywhere from 70 laws one year to last year was 224. I call it the unconstitutionality index, the multiple of these thousands of regulations over the numbers of laws that Congress passes each year and that the president signs. But what's interesting too, though, is the amount of regulations we don't measure. You can get cost of regulations for some economic regulatory costs, some social regulatory costs. The OMB puts out an annual report, and it's called Report to Congress on the Benefits and Costs of Regulations. But of those 3,500 regulations, guess how many regulations in last year's report had a cost-benefit analysis? 7. And the year before that, 14. Now, there is, if you dig deeper in the report, there is another dozen or so that have cost estimates alone. So you can bump the number up to in the 20s that the OMB recognizes as a cost of regulation. So you can't credit the criticisms of regulatory costs. It's incumbent on those imposing those regulations to say what they cost and to acknowledge them. But even with that, I call that, I put a funnel together every year. Here are the numbers of regulations. Here are the numbers that OMB looked at. Here are the numbers that had a cost estimate. Here are the ones that had a cost-benefit analysis, and you get less than 1%. But it's worse than that, because there are other categories of regulation that completely fly under the radar and don't get measured at all. And I think when you say what's the thing that jumps out at you the most, I think this is it. And this is where we need help from staffers like you all, a lot of you here in this room, is the unmeasured, the unfathomed cost of regulation. And there's a lot of economic regulatory costs, for example, that fit in this category. Antitrust regulation. Antitrust changes the trajectory of entire industries in the economy every time a ruling hits, but we have no idea what the cost of antitrust regulation is. And there are other economic regulatory costs like that in cybersecurity, in airline regulation, and on down the line that we don't have the slightest idea what it costs. Another cost of regulation that doesn't get measured is job cost, believe it or not. Most of the regulatory impact analyses don't look at job cost, and if they do, they say, like Gina McCarthy testifying in Congress, EPA regulations create jobs. They might create compliance jobs, these $150,000, $220,000 jobs that compliance officers make. There was like 9 billion hours of paperwork last year. What does that even mean? I mean, in terms of a lifetime, I was trying to figure it out. It's like, well, a person lives 80 years, that's like 700,000 hours, so it's like 13,000 human lifetimes a year just to do paperwork. So that's another cost of regulation that doesn't get measured. Another cost of regulation that doesn't get measured that I think a lot of you who work on this issue, whatever party you're in, should look at, is what I call the cost of benefits. All the things that we want to regulate into existence, food safety, cybersecurity, financial stability, on down the line, those are forms of wealth. you need markets to increase those. You can't eject the free market system from the function of elevating the safety features and other things in the economy that we have to have. I think that matters a lot. And the last one I'll mention with respect to unmeasured regulatory costs is what I'm calling regulatory dark matter, because it's not just the 200 laws last year, it's not just the 3,500 regulations, but now there are guidance documents, bulletins, notices, blog posts, press releases, phone calls, pen and phone, all of these new ways that that regulation is growing and impacting the economy and making companies and people change their behavior that don't show up on the radar at all. No matter how good we get at measuring regulatory costs, we're leaving out all of this dark matter. And it really is incumbent on the staff up here working with the members to recognize it and do something about it. Now, I give you all these negative numbers, but as we go on, I'm going to leave you on a positive message. I think there are things that we can do, and I'm very, very optimistic about the future and about what the short version of it is you don't have to tell the grass to grow, you just have to take the rocks off of it. But that's a big important thing that we need to do. But part of it is addressing the regulatory state. We're never going to measure cost perfectly, but we can make certain people accountable, and we can do things about the separation of powers crisis and things like that to deal with it. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, your remarks remind me, economists, of course, we're fond of talking about the basically benevolent, invisible hand of the market. You seem to identify the invisible fist of the regulatory state.
But don't discount the market's own. I don't like the term self-regulation. I don't think that's what businesses do. But businesses don't operate in a vacuum. Don't let anybody say to you, laissez-faire just means companies run wild. You don't want any regulation. That's absolutely the wrong lesson, and it's even incorrect. Companies don't operate in a vacuum. They've all got their upstream business suppliers that they have to please, their downstream business customers, Wall Street, consumers, the media, advertisers. There are all of these forces that are arrayed against companies that misbehave. And a lot of times I think what regulation does is it removes those kinds of functions. So in that sense, regulation doesn't even work. It's non-cognitive. It's not even a way that you discipline forces in markets. All new products and innovations are going to have risks. But part of the job of capitalism is to build, as Liya was saying, those risk management institutions that have to emerge alongside those new nanotechnologies and so on down the line. So.
Patrick, so, and maybe I'm not up to date. These things it changes rapidly here in Capitol Hill. But last I've heard is that there's actually some greater than zero chance that the Export-Import Bank will be shuttered. And to play devil's advocate, somewhat, people do say this. Well, that's all wrong. We need the wise guiding hand of government to push dollars into the industries of tomorrow and to protect our strategic interests, to protect those industries that really deserve protection, to help us compete against foreigners. What would you say, Patrick McLaughlin, to someone who expresses worry that by shutting down an institution such as the Export-Import Bank, that we as a nation are somehow giving up an important tool or weapon to maintain our competitive economic status on the globe?
Well, first I'd probably ask how the weather is in Seattle. But I think probably anyone who does have the story that shutting down XM or cutting back the amount of intervention XM can do will lead to some sort of economic catastrophe probably does have ulterior motives, and the reason is it's an exaggerated story. Last time I looked, it's not something I track, but last time I looked, the total amount of exports relative to GDP from the U.S. economy is about 13%. So about 13% of the GDP is exports. Now, XM supposedly touches around 2% of all those exports. So that's 2% of 13%. Which, if you do the math, works out to about 1/4% of the economy that is touched by XM. So I don't think that should scare anyone, even if that were to go to zero. But we're not even talking about that going to zero. It could be a gradual shutdown from what I understand. I'm no expert on this, but I've read what my colleagues have written. And apparently, if there's not a new charter, what already exists doesn't just disappear. that gets played out. So it's not going to be a sudden shock for that 0.25% of the economy. It would be a gradual transition. And so it's those numbers alone just make me think anyone who's saying this either is uninformed or has something else working, motivating that question. I guess the second thing that occurs to me as an economist, it seems that the same people who are saying we need to worry about XM, we need to keep XM in place, these are important subsidies to exporting companies, are the same people who think that corporate tax breaks are a bad idea. But to me, they're equivalent. They both distort the economy. They both have long-run problems for economic growth. They both create inefficiencies. Subsidies and taxes are just two sides of the same coin. So I would like to see people make that connection more often and understand that, and that's probably a fault of us economic educators, that's not as well understood as it should be. And then my final thought on this is any sort of policy intervention, such as subsidies, creates winners and losers. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to be unsympathetic. There would be some upheaval, there would be some disruption, but that's the case in any sort of policy change that in the long run would lead to a better economic system. We had policy disruption in the first place when XM was created and picked winners and created some losers. We had the same sort of thing when we see implementation of, say, free trade agreements. There are some people who have been previously benefited by government policies, and now we're taking that away. Yes, there will be some short-term disruptions, but in the long run, this all leads to better economic growth, better outcomes for everyone, for taxpayers above all.
Yeah, one thing people miss in these kind of discussions, especially involving international economic freedom, such as subsidies to this kind of subsidies that the XM Bank bestows, is that it is true foreign governments are no less likely than the U.S. government to hand out goodies and favors. But the public discussion too often takes place as if those goodies and favors that are handed out by foreign governments come free of charge. Foreign governments can no more subsidize free of charge than can the U.S. government. If the foreign government gives subsidies to one industry, it has to take those resources from somewhere else, so it's making other industries weaker. And we never hear about that. So it's not. It's just false to say that foreign governments that subsidize various of their industries are making those economies stronger. They're not. They're making those economies weaker, and we shouldn't play the same game. I have a general question just for the panel, and so any one of you who wishes to jump in, and some of you have hinted at this in the past. Can entrepreneurs be too free? I mean, surely we need some top-down oversight. Can entrepreneurs be too free? Is that most people believe that they can? What about you guys and gal?
Within the rule of law, no, I don't think they can. Everybody should read The Use of Knowledge in Society and by Friedrich Hayek, and articles like that. Any entrepreneurial waste, I think, we had talked about some of this before. Too many companies trying to do the same thing. And that's what the old line socialists try to do. You need one big paperclip factory, that kind of thing. But it's not wasteful when entrepreneurs are investing those resources. That is all a process of reallocation that takes place all of the time. And capital is always being reinvested when that occurs. Companies go bankrupt, they get taken over, they get put into more efficient use, the capital gets put into more efficient use. So I don't think they're too free in that regard. It implies, is top-down management from the federal government a good thing, and I don't think it is ever.
You guys want to add anything?
I think it's important to highlight the alternative, which Wayne just did, top-down management from the government. Sure, I will freely acknowledge, as I think most economists would, that markets do fail sometimes, but governments fail also, and in my opinion, fail worse. So, given those two alternatives, I'll still pick markets. And I'll give an example here. I think there was a buildup of regulations around the taxi industry in several states and some localities for decades, right? And suddenly, over the last few years, we've seen a huge disruption of that sector in the form of Uber and Lyft, and that's been a wonderful thing for everyone who wants to move around from place A to place B. But these regulations that were created were often literally given the justification of we don't want too many taxi drivers competing. It would be too much entrepreneurship, I guess would be the phrase here. They would put each other out of business. And so we're going to limit the number of taxi drivers we can have in New York, medallion system there, et cetera. And even if that was well-intentioned, which I'm cynical, I doubt, but even if it were, the result is that created a system that wouldn't have allowed this wonderful innovation that is Uber. And the only reason Uber has been able to do what it did is because it ignored these regulatory systems for long enough to build up a customer base that made it impossible for the regulators then to shut them down.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. Lee, do you have anything you want to add? Or?
Yeah, so I think when people hear the term free entrepreneur, they all of a sudden think of, oh no, this person is going to do terrible things and they're not regulated. And I think it's important just to emphasize that, saying the entrepreneur is free does not mean he or she can do anything, because there's other constraints on the entrepreneur. There's norms, there's reputation, and a variety of other things that they have to abide by. And so this taxi example is excellent, the taxi and Uber, because when Uber started popping up in New York City, everyone is like, oh no, they're going to do terrible things. And then they point to something a bad driver in Uber did. And they're like, oh, look, this happens. And that's why we need taxis and regulation. And I'm like, it happens in the taxi and in the taxis as well. You just might not hear about it in this case. And it's a good thing that we're hearing about it from Uber. And then that Uber driver got fired. So it's one of these things that when people think it's free from regulation, they have this mindset that it's all chaotic now. And instead, you just have to understand that it's not free. They're also constrained. And so their behaviors are constrained.
I remember many of you in this room are not old enough to remember. Regrettably, I am. When airlines were deregulated in the late 1970s. And there was surprisingly, a lot of it coming from the legacy carriers themselves, shockingly, a lot of concern that, well, this regulation is going to lead to disaster. Airlines can't compete in a deregulated regime. Of course, what happened is that fare went down, the quality of service went up, the safety of airline travel now is at an all-time high. And so you hear these kinds of fears expressed all the time, and they most often prove false. There's another general question. In the research you guys have done and the thought that you've given to this topic, do you sense any difference between the impact that government regulation has on large companies as compared to small companies? Wayne?
Everybody's going to say yes to that, and I think the important takeaway from it is, there's entrepreneurship, and there's also political entrepreneurship that you see in virtually any market. If I were to say that I'm very optimistic, because I think that young people now don't want their Uber regulated. Marco Rubio and other Ted Cruz and others have gone around speaking on the wonders of tech, and young people don't want tech regulated and so forth. But what I'm concerned about now is regulation on frontier industries, and this ties into the big businesses versus small that you're talking about. If we do things right, most of the world's wealth hasn't been created yet. Capitalism is still very young. It's only a few centuries old, and we're building up those institutions that Liya talked about. But we have to come up with ways of keeping regulation off the frontier, and unfortunately, we're failing a little bit. You mentioned economic regulation. When airlines were deregulated, several sectors of economic regulation were going down. Mm-hmm. But now with Dodd-Frank and energy regulation and so forth, that's moving back up again, which is really worrisome. But also in these frontier sectors, you could imagine the Uber brass very soon saying, well, we're settled in these cities pretty well, so it might be a good idea for us to get rules in place that benefit Uber. Another one is net neutrality in the FCC. The justification for FCC had been public scarcity of the airwaves and public purpose. The plethora that we have on the internet, now that everybody's a broadcaster, has taken away that justification, and yet FCC is still here with brand new calls for regulation of net neutrality, and that's like antitrust. That changes the entire trajectory of the industry. It completely changes what the telecommunications industry is. And you can go on down the line in various sectors. Nanotechnology, we can have a Bill Gates of nanotechnology and leave the technologies unregulated, or we can have every new advance, like a new medical device, where the FDA has to get involved. involved. Privacy regulation is another issue. Cybersecurity is another, where you've got a choice between the government's police and then the private sector's door locks and barbed wire. I want to see the private sector's role grow. Unfortunately, what I see on the Hill is the opposite. So you've got a chance to wall off the future from excess regulation, but I feel like if we don't get out in front of those kinds of things, we can too easily overregulate the frontier.
Want to add anything?
Sure. So I think one of Wayne's points is that there's this massive set of regulations that any business would face, and to take it back to the small versus large business, you can think of that, and economists often do. I'm sure Liya and people who think about entrepreneurship think about the fixed cost of entry into an industry. So how do you go from the choice of being just a person to an entrepreneur? Making that choice and implementing that choice requires things like learning what laws you would have to follow. So a long time ago, when I started doing research and regulation, I said, let me get a handle on the number of laws I would have to follow. Wayne's got, the 10,000 Commandments is one of his publications. I said, all right, I'm going to actually count these things. And if you've ever looked at a contract signed, maybe when you bought a house, the words that are important in legal writing are words like shall and must. So I counted up the shalls and the musts and the may nots and the prohibited in the Code of Federal Regulations. And I figured out that there's well over 1 million of those words in the Code of Federal Regulations. So if you're a small business person and you want to open up a business, there's no way you could understand that. I also calculated how long it would take to read the Code of Federal Regulations. It would take you about 3 years if you read it as a full-time job. You read it all the time, year-round. So you can't understand it. You're going to be, from day one, probably in violation of the law. Now, does that make it a dangerous position to be in? This is what I worry about. I think when you're small and you're unnoticed, you may not be on the radar screen of regulators. But then if you're one of these frontier industries that suddenly becomes hot, that suddenly becomes really important in the economy, suddenly the regulators zoom in on you. It's that transition from small to medium that really is probably where the headaches are mostly created from this million-plus regulations that people have to potentially deal with. And that's going to be, that disincentivizes growth, right? If the problem is going from small to medium, then maybe you just want to stay small. That's not what you want to reward in a free market economy.
Yeah, and just to give an example that I've been studying recently, tech startups are normally small, and one of the biggest costs that they have to deal with is, well, for one, we think of tech startups as the least regulated, but even then, even though the tech startups are the least regulated, they're still over-regulated, and there's still a ton of costs that they have to deal with that's a lot for them because they don't even have a product yet to launch, and they still have to hire, as Wayne was talking about, these lawyers that are extremely expensive for them in order to just to comply with the law to start up the business before they even launch their product. So I was talking to some tech startup owners who this particular tech startup owner has been operating for, I think, like 11 months or so now, and he still hasn't been able to launch their product yet because they're still hiring lawyers in order to go through all the different, how to pay off equity and deal with the option plans for the people that they're hiring, even though they're not actually hiring them. They have to hire them as consultants because it costs too much to hire them as real, working for them, as their actual employees. So they have to hire them as in consultants, and then they have to go by all of these basically regulations in order to just, launch a product, but they haven't even had the chance to launch the product yet because it's so expensive to launch the product.
I remember years ago, you may remember George McGovern famously, after he retired from Congress, he started a B&B in his home state, bed and breakfast, and he was shocked to learn the number of regulations that a B&B owner, and he had the decency to confess. He said, all my life, I don't remember his exact words, all my life I've been passing these regulations, not thinking anything. Now I really get it. Right? These are really burdensome. What was I doing?
Don, can I add one more thing on this?
Yeah, sure.
So earlier you mentioned, or actually Senator Johnson mentioned the Stockholm Syndrome. And Wayne has mentioned dark matter, regulatory dark matter, this stuff that we don't know quite what it is and how it affects us. I think those two are related. So if you have a business, an entrepreneur who's started up and paid those costs to understand what laws that person has to deal with, there's always the chance that will change, especially when it comes to guidance and interpretations. So we're in a world that's post-Perez versus Mortgage Bankers Association. That was a Supreme Court case that said that agencies, at least at the federal level, are able to reinterpret their own guidance however they want to. And what that case was, that initially the Department of Labor had said that mortgage loan officers won't be subject to overtime rules. That was their official position. Then 4 years later, Department of Labor said, oh, actually, we changed our mind. They are subject to overtime rules.
Yeah.
That's a big change. Yeah. And that was just a reinterpretation of their own guidance. And if you're a business person, if you're operating under what you think are the rules of the game, you're operating in good faith, they can change the rules of the game. So you better be giving them that glass of water in order to have them not change the rules of the game.
Yeah, this is what the economist Bob Higgs describes as regime uncertainty, and shows that it's really, really poisonous to the economy. We don't have much time left for this part of the session. I'd really quickly from each of you, or from any one of you, what's the difference between market entrepreneurship and political entrepreneurship? Both seek gains.
Yeah, I think we hit on a lot of it. It's easy for businessmen to run to Washington. I can remember when I'd worked on the Hill in the '90s, and then I remember when Microsoft had one lobbyist here, who was camping out in the office of a law firm in town, and that
Jack Abramoff.
That's it. But now they have these huge lobbying shops, and there's this debate. I remember Cato having this great debate with T.J. Rogers of, should the tech sector engage with Washington? Should we even be here at all? But in effect, they come and get you if you're not, and that's why we do require these fixes here. A lot of that is going to involve you guys on different staffs working with, rolling back the regulatory state as much as you can so that you don't attract this political entrepreneurship. But unfortunately, we have that political entrepreneurship. You think about it. Think about all the sectors now. Renewable energy is full of it. Obviously, with Obamacare and the aftermath of that, Dodd-Frank and the big banks who are still too big, the alleged justification was too big to fail, but we've exacerbated that in financial services on down the line. Net neutrality and FCC regulation. All of these areas are attracting the crony type of entrepreneurship rather than entrepreneurship, and you have to be very, very cautious about it. Part of the answers are some of the reforms that are floating around here. There's the Reg Reduction Commission notion. There's the REINS Act to make Congress approve all of these rules. But a big part of it, too, is you got to get Liberty's meat axe after this pen and phone, and I think we need to come up with some ways of doing that. As time goes on, if you can extend regulation with the pen and phone, I think you can. If you can curtail liberty with the pen and phone, I think you can extend it too and I'm talking about within the rule of law. I mean, I even remember a segment in Romney's campaign where he said Congress needs to pass the REINS Act to make sure we approve regulations. He said, but if they don't, I am going to say no EPA rule is going to go through unless Congress approves it. Okay, now you're getting on the right track. You're saying, if Congress wants that regulation bad enough, Congress needs to pass it. So.
Okay. Let's we have a few minutes left. Let's have a few minutes, maybe 5 or so, for Q&A from you folks. Just fire away, whatever curiosity. Yes, sir.